Good afternoon, EMBS members, non-members, and future members. Um, Welcome to our last, but not the least, webinar of the year. Yes, this is Christian Ramiscal. I am, the chair of IEEE EMBS, and I will be introducing Summer. She is also one of the officer of the IEEE EMBS chapter in Phoenix. So, Summer, when you're ready, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you, Christian. I hope everybody can hear me. As Christian mentioned, my name is Summer. I'm the publicity chair of IEEE EMBS group. So today I will be introducing Don McDonald. So it's really my pleasure to introduce to you a colleague and friend that I currently work with at the University of Arizona on senior capstone projects. He's been an awesome mentor, but I'm really excited for you guys to get to know him as more than that. Really get a chance to understand his experience and his background, and hopefully you can learn some awesome information from him. So in general, Don has had quite a long career of 40 plus years in electrical engineering, highly successful, primarily in the semiconductor manufacturing area. He's also had many qualifying and impressive positions. He's been a WAFAB manager, a vice president of operations, a director of operations. And after that, he not only transitioned from being an employee, but actually went on to be consultant. He actually founded 2 consulting firms and incorporated a European subsidiary of Thomas Group. So very impressive accomplishments. And even beyond that, he later went on to become the president of JDST Eindhoven. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And finally was the COO for Intense Photonics in Scotland. So as I mentioned again, now Don is retired and serves as one of the mentors for the senior capstone project for the engineering class of the University of Arizona College of Engineering. So with that, I'm going to pass it out to Don, and I hope you guys enjoy the presentation. Thank you for joining. Don, I'll pass it off to you.
All right. Thank you, Summer. I hope everybody can hear me, and I hope I can move these slides from one to the next. So I want to thank the IEEE EMBS Phoenix chapter for inviting me. This is great. And all of the attendees. I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to share my experiences, both the ones that were successful and the ones that weren't so successful. It's always true that not every decision makes sense, but I have a few that didn't make much sense in hindsight, and I'll talk about how I recovered from those. But this is career development and navigation. How does one manage a career? And this is a big problem in my view. It's probably an understated one. So let me see if I can move on from this slide, because I haven't been able. There we go. This is the background, and Summer went over this. And I've been in a lot of businesses, semiconductor manufacturing being one. That led to some, and that was 20 years. I did some consulting, which was an interesting choice to make. And then I did get into founding my own companies. These were consulting businesses as well. And then I kind of switched gears and went into laser manufacturing. And of course, I am a mentor for the Senior Engineering Capstone Project at the U of A in Tucson. So I wanted to talk a second about mentored projects. I've done some in aerospace, electronic manufacturing, biomedical, some telemetry, and I found there was really this was delightful that biomedical and my background in electronics kind of overlap quite a bit, and there's a lot of teams that are doing some amazing work in this area. Now, one of the things I wanted to get into is when you look at your career, some of you may be just beginning, some of you may be well along, and there's lots of opportunities and choices that will come up. These are, I call, forks in the road. And how you navigate that is really pretty important to your career. So I'll talk about some things where the opportunities I had and the choices I faced and the choices I made. And as I said, some were good, some were not so good. But the thought process and decision making that I went through, I will explore with you. And I'll even come back to some of those because there's a lot of learning that you can get out of these as just examples. So then I'm going to talk about some ideas and tools here. So I have two things that I'd like to start with. And these aren't so obvious, maybe they are, but I found, they were key to me. They were key to me being able to get on with my career. And I think it's true for any career because what they are is one, have a set of core competencies. Be something that you're the best at or one of the best. Be something that it's where you can or are recognized as one of the best in the field in a particular area. Hopefully it's the area that you want to work in, of course. And so no matter what, keep those up and make them match where you want your career to go. Because I think these core competencies allow you to steer your career and recover. And I'll talk about some recoveries that I made for sure that I was glad I had some core competencies to fall back on. And I would say my core competency really for most of it was wafer manufacturing, how to run a big plant really successfully, deep technical issues, and still get the production out at a cost goal. And, wafer fab plants, while I worked in electronics, wafer fab plants are really chemistry and physics for the most part. And then when you finish, then electrical engineering comes into play. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think, be careful about this one. You really want to take responsibility for managing the relationship with your boss. Everybody has a boss, and they can make a dramatic difference on how well your career moves, or do you actually have to, take a step back and maybe move because the relationship isn't good. Now, to be honest, I never had a bad boss. And maybe that was pure luck on my part, but I think part of it was due to I did manage that relationship. I made sure I understand really what he and his department wanted and how I fit into it and how I could go ahead and do what was needed. And one other side note before I go on. I believe, and someone will have to tell me, Summer or Christian, if this is wrong, but it's okay. And in fact, it's desirable if you have a question, pop in now. And Summer, correct me if that's not right, but I would be happy to take questions on the fly.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody who has questions, feel free to either speak them out loud. We'll also have a dedicated 10-minute Q&A session at the end. So if you don't feel comfortable speaking up, go ahead and type your questions into the chat bar at the bottom right-hand corner, and we'll address those at the end.
Thank you, Summer. So going on now. So these are just two things that transcend a career everywhere. Having those core competencies, hone them, improve upon them, guide them to make sure that you add things that are necessary to make your career move on. Now, let's start about then back into the core of the presentation, early career development and issues. And I'm talking starting at the very beginning. You're not even out of college maybe, and we'll carry this on through my career as just an example. And it's only a good example because it hits on a lot of different possibilities that I went through. So internships is a great way to start thinking about a career. An internship tells you a lot about the company. It tells you a lot about the work that you might be involved in. And both are important. You can't have a good career if the field isn't the right one or the company isn't the right one. So everyone has to make these choices, and you have to actually make them earlier in the career. Which company do you want to go to? What, and sometimes more importantly, what department of a company? And then there's always the startups versus established companies. And I've talked to a number of students going out of the Engineering 498 course, and they say the following, at least on average. You know, there was a lot of good choices out there, but nothing struck me as being, you know, perfect. And so what I wanted to do was, you know, and this is the average person, get in and choose a job and get established and understand some of these issues that I just raised. What's the company like, the department like, how is it managed, what's the technical challenges, et cetera. And then maybe come back and start saying, okay, now I understand this well enough to go ahead. But that depends upon how you do it. One other thing you have to think about, I believe, is early in your career, scope out. Do you want to go down a highly technical path, or do you want to go more into a managing of technical people path? You know, so the highly technical is going to R&D, in-depth technical things. Management may mean equal amount of technology, but ultimately you've got to manage people and develop those capabilities. So to move on with me and to set some examples for you, because I interned at Motorola, and I was very happy with how Motorola Semiconductor, now it's right there in Phoenix, at least it used to be, how Motorola operated. So I went there. And I worked as a single contributor engineer for about a year. Then I managed a small group of engineers and techs. And this was in the what was called IC R&D at the time, integrated circuit R&D. But it was really more like applied R&D because we had a big contract with IBM to develop logic chips for one of their computer systems. And that was actually pretty successful. There was a lot of technology development. How do you get, 3 layers of metal with the insulator and the vias to connect? How do you get all of that technology to work together? It took several years to get that right. And I don't exaggerate because I started in the middle of this. It had already been several years, and it wasn't solved until a few months after I started into it. But that's the way technology is. So this led to a startup, and how that happened, and I was not a part of it, but the team of Motorola people and a team of IBM people and some people from Fairchild Semiconductor out in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, these got together, got some funding, and started up a company. It was called AMS. And I wrote AMS Intersil here because I'll tell you what happened. After about a year, they had their factory running and they made me a nice offer. And this was the first fork in the road. You leave an established company for a startup. And, at that age, you're young, you think, nothing can go wrong, first of all. But secondly, if it does, I'll figure out how to get out of it. That changes, that attitude probably changes over time. At any rate, we went there and AMS made memory chips And then they used some of those memory chips. They sold some on the open market. They used some of them in IBM memory systems, or at least memory systems that would attach to IBM computers. And I was in product engineering there. And I'll tell you, the company, though, after a year or so, it started to stagnate. And sure enough, I did too. And I started to get nervous, but the good news was the board of directors actually brought in a new president, and the new president did two things right away. I mean, really right away, the first 2 months. He brought in a new vice president of manufacturing, and he arranged a merger with Intersil. Now, AMS was an acquiring company, but they took the name Intersil because it was better known. And so that whole thing became got just revised. It got revitalized. And the new vice president of manufacturing, after about 3 months I was there, realized, let me give you the scope of the thing. AMS had one wafer fab, Intersil had three. And so the vice president of manufacturing asked me to go run one of these wafer fabs over at the old Intersil. And I did. And frankly, that was completely out of my zone of comfort. But it was one of the smartest and best decisions I ever made, because I got in there, I learned a lot, I absorbed a lot of things that had to be done, and I started running this whole factory, quite frankly, really well. And by the way, a wafer fab manager was one of these jobs that at this age in the semiconductor industry was a key job. It was viewed as the stepping stone up to much higher level jobs. If you hadn't been a wafer fab manager, you probably weren't going to be vice president of something. So it was really a good deal. They were highly coveted kinds of jobs, and it went really well. And in fact, it went well enough that the company asked me to run another wafer fab simultaneously. Now, that was a bit of a stretch, I have to say, because it was in a different town. Now, they weren't very far apart. They were 7 miles apart, but one was in Santa Clara, California. One was in Sunnyvale. And I had to travel back and forth and keep my old one running well and get the new one to me anyway, to run well. And that happened, and it was quite successful. And so it would sound like, everything is going really well. But in fact, I'd been there about 10 years after all this stagnation, and then running these wafer fabs for multiple years. And I started looking around, and National Semiconductor came up. And so I looked at that, and I made really just a lateral move. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But I went to National, and it was a little different. It was a bigger wafer fab. It had more sales, but it had the full profit and loss, or P&L, responsibility. So I was able to run the factory, have the engineering, but get into the business aspects of it. And that's when I started going to graduate school also for an MBA. And the reason I made this move, so think about this one. This had to do with money. Some of these decisions have to do with money. Some have to do with the challenge and the sheer compatibility or challenge. But when I was really successful with the wafer fab at the first one at Intersil, and then took on the second one, I never got a special raise to basically double my workload. And so that kind of irritated me. That was number one. Number two, Intersil had the president that did all these wonderful things. He moved on. And so watch out for this. when the leadership changes. But the president moved on. The company looked like it was going to stagnate a bit. That was my feeling. And I didn't see how it was going to compete with AMD and Intel and Fairchild and some of these other companies, including National, or the Japanese companies. By then, they'd started entering, especially the memory field. So it was basically a similar job, but a much more successful company, I thought, going forward, especially, and a bit of more money. So I worked at National there, and things were going along quite well. And, one of these rare occurrences happened. A little over a year after I was at National, things were going quite well. A headhunter called me, and which brings me to the next slide. And this was really controversial. And I want to ask some of you to talk on this point with me. But I'll show you why. So here I was at a Silicon Valley mainstream company, National, and these guys, the headhunter was talking about an unknown to me. It was a small Honeywell facility in Colorado Springs. Now, it did have two major product lines, and it had a nice wafer fab for both, but it was completely out of the mainstream, both physical location and products. So here were the issues and the challenges. Monetary issues were significant, and I'll tell you about that. If I can find my exact numbers here, but monetarily, here was the deal. They offered, and I went out, they finally persuaded me to at least go interview. They'd pay for a flight out and back and a weekend in Colorado Springs. So I went there, and it wasn't too bad. They were good people. Things went well, and they made me an offer. Now, this offer had like 4 components to it that were monetary. One, it was a 50% raise. 2, it had a $10,000 signing bonus. Now, that was back a while ago. That'd be like $30,000 now, probably, with inflation. It had a full cost, complete coverage to move, and it had a country club membership. And so they threw a lot of money at this thing. So that was where that one went, and so it was also quite different. The risks were obvious, though. Little tiny company, not Honeywell, but this semiconductor piece of it. Honeywell's an enormous company, so the risks were obvious. I think they were more career risks than anything, and so I thought I had a way back to the mainstream if this didn't work out. I would have a much bigger salary, and I thought it was clear. I thought I had a good reputation, good enough reputation to go back to the mainstream kinds of businesses, even back to National, because I never burned any bridges anywhere. So I'd like some feedback. If you were sitting here today and had this kind of opportunity, what would you do? Anybody?
So Don, if no one else wants to jump in, I might jump in here. Personally, I would describe myself as a very conservative, not really willing to take risks, or maybe, in my opinion, unnecessary risks. I like the known quantities. So if it were my choice, I would probably stick with mainstream. But I'm curious to see if anybody else has a similar opinion or even a differing opinion. So I'll open it up for anybody else as well.
Hey, Don.
Hey,
I when you lay it all out and you have it all clearly listed out, and in hindsight, the jump doesn't seem too bad. I think I have to agree with Summer, though. If I didn't know if I didn't know that I had a, you know, a clear parachute back to a mainstream company, I mean, that's not an easy decision to make. But I think if you have like what you did, where you steward relationships well, and you know that this isn't a it isn't a cul-de-sac, you know, there's a way through if it goes south. You know, I would take that decision. I think it's a good option, and there's a lot of good adventure in that too.
Yeah, and I agree with you guys because if I came back to that, in retrospect, I think that was a dumb decision, kind of dumb. But the good news is it solved itself almost, and I'll show how that worked in just a moment. And it solved itself because when I was thinking I knew a way back, I was thinking going back to National or AMD or somebody like that I knew. But what happened was this, and here was my way back, and this shows if you get either lucky or plan well ahead, you know, you can recover from these. And it worked out maybe for the better. And what happened was Honeywell owned a company called Centertech. And it was a mainstream chip manufacturer, and it was in Sunnyvale, California. And they made me this offer for plant manager in a brand new state-of-the-art plant they built in Santa Cruz, California. It was a wafer stepper-based fab, no more scanners, no more wafer exposure tools exposing the whole wafer. It was probably, I think it was the first in the world of this. And so I got into that, and there was a lot of things I really liked about being a plant manager. You know, up till now, my boss had always been down the hall. And I'm sure that's true with a lot of you. But here, my boss was 50 miles away. And, you know, I sent him reports and we talked by phone, but we didn't meet, you know, terribly often. Now, one reason was the plant did quite well. It ramped up well. And so there wasn't a lot of need for that. By ramp up, I mean, you know, you get all the tools in place, the process, you got the people hired, and you start building 10 wafers a day, 100 wafers a day, 500 wafers a day, and 1,000 wafers a day. That's the ramp. And we had to get to 1,000 wafers a day within a year, which we did. And it became the most productive wafer fab in the company. And that was one of my most enjoyable experiences in my career, was this plant where it was autonomous in the sense that I had HR and I had finance and I had engineering and I had manufacturing and, you know, maintenance and everything. And it was mine. And I liked that. But things happen. Of course, the outcome of doing a good job was you get sometimes rewarded. And this was going back to Sunnyvale as vice president of operations, because Centertech also had 2 other wafer fabs over in Sunnyvale. And so I did that for about a year when the semiconductor industry had a downturn. And you know, they have these every 3 to 4 years, things tail off, kind of a recession in semiconductors. And so what happened was Honeywell decided they had to sell this company. And I think it was totally because they didn't like the cyclicality of the business as much as their more traditional businesses. And it's really a high capital cost business. So I didn't think they liked that. So sale of a company, though. Here I was vice president of operations. About 80% of the people in the company worked for me, and they decided to sell it. And they asked me to do a couple of things. One is keep the place running, and 2, downsize it. So that what they started to do is trim product lines and move good product lines out of Sunnyvale over to Santa Cruz and close those. And therefore I had to lay those people off. So this is a big problem, and you really have to work at that. You have to plan it out, be positive, get prepared, because a lot of people are going to face downsizing or being sold or closure somewhere in your career. You probably will. So in my example, as I said, Honeywell, I think, sold it because capital costs and cyclicality. But what I had to do was communicate. We developed our plan. I communicated that to everybody, in every department at least once a week. And then you have to think about how are you going to do this? Because here's the problem. The very best people can go get a job anytime. How do you keep them? So we had to have bonuses that were payable if you stayed through the whole ordeal until it was sold, which was, they estimated about 6 months out. And we had a whole bunch of those, and that worked. It was difficult, but I kept the factory running. I moved people out of Sunnyvale to Santa Cruz. I laid off a whole bunch, and it was still operating very well. And we pruned the product line that weren't doing well, and so it was an attractive business. Now, one other note I would make, and it did sell. It was attractive and it sold. And one other note, Honeywell hired a consulting company to advise us. This was Thomas Group, and I'll talk more about them. But we did complete the sale. They advised us. They were very good. And as sale time comes around, guess what? I had to start thinking about another job. So Thomas Group then offered me a job in consulting. And they were the preeminent consulting business in high-tech semiconductors. So that wasn't too bad. But I could never at this time think of myself as a consultant. So I went back and looked at industry jobs as well. And I ended up with 2. And they were both with AMD. One was the director of a business unit. So this is the business unit. By that, they've got design and they've got P&L, so they got marketing and design, and they control how profitable they are based upon their designs and how the factory can build them and how they can sell them. It's a coveted position. It really is. And we were in that area. Sunnyvale I was in Saratoga, it's right next door, so it was no problem moving. But the other choice was AMD had this Austin, Texas, brand new addition to a wafer fab area. They built 3 new wafer fabs, state of the art. These were stepper also, but they were also the first. Well, they actually weren't the first. Intel had the first 150 millimeter wafer fab, and here was number 2, 3, and 4. So, another question. Anybody chime in, please. How would you choose between these 2? This is a better choice. I don't think you can go wrong with either one of these. How do you choose, though? Anybody have comments, please?
Don, would it start to get to where you are in your life and whether you want to move and make a big geographical change and what you start to value in terms of whether you really, really love your direction of the actual manufacturing, or if you like the company enough and like where you're living in that situation that you settle, quote unquote, for managing the business side of things.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. That was exactly what I went through, and it ended up, and I think both would have been absolutely wonderful choices, but I ended up going with the wafer fab operation in Austin because probably it was familiar, number one. Number two, this was one of the leading facilities in the world at that moment in time. And I was building all of AMD's prime chips, from PROMs to CPUs to, there were about 50 products went through my 3 fabs. So Ethan is right, but those were the choices. The move was a bit of a problem, but it was not a big deal. And this was a wonderful job as well, and I really enjoyed it. One was ready to start up. The next 2 were still being outfitted, and I got them all 3 running in a short period of time. But as you may suspect, Thomas Group didn't leave. they kept coming back, and they would phone and they would visit me, and they talked about, interesting stuff. And they started talking about, we're getting a lot of more business, including business in Europe. And so I went after this. Hard to believe, because at the time before this, I thought I would never, ever do this. But I don't think anyone views consulting in quite the same light. It was a strange decision. And in retrospect, financially, it probably wasn't the best. But it was a leading company. You could go apply your expertise to a whole bunch of companies. You could learn from these whole bunch of other companies. Had a bunch of clients in the technical field. They had 30 clients. This is a tiny list. And it was just really interesting to do. But one of the things that, I guess I thought was interesting was being able to go to Europe. So Siemens was the first client. ST Micro was the second, and I managed that project at ST Micro. And we'd fly over 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, work in the US 2 weeks, go over there for 2 weeks. And that was successful enough, and other teams were successful enough. Thomas Group, now in hindsight, this was, like I said, this was a questionable move, but I did it. So going back to the story, Thomas Group decided that, we needed a European subsidiary. The reasons were business was growing in Europe, and it was growing pretty fast, not as fast as the US, but pretty fast. But this transatlantic staffing of projects was a problem. It was hard to get people that could leave on Saturday, work 2 weeks, and come back the next Saturday, and then work the following 2 weeks at home. So you had abbreviated weekends, to say the least, sometimes. And then we were starting thinking we were going to run into language skills. That wasn't as big a problem as you may think, because all of the people we dealt with, the higher level, the directors or the presidents, spoke very good English. So we had to do that. But the result was of all that, having good projects over there and seeing these problems, is I went and incorporated a subsidiary in Frankfurt, Germany. And so then I went and moved to Germany. I was there 3.5 years, and I worked in developing a client base throughout the whole of the Europe, and I mean from Norway, Bergen and Oslo down to Catania in Italy. I had projects, and it was, again, it was pretty darn successful, and it was really interesting, I have to say. So that 3.5 years were over, and I'm going to skip this question, but think about this. Do you have thoughts on going out of the country for an extended period of time? If anyone wants to pop in with a quick comment, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll move on, because I just realized time is flitting here. I was having so much fun telling this story that I'm losing track of time. So I had to return to the Thomas Group in the US. And what happened was and I got a few notes here to keep me straight. When I returned, Thomas Group, of course, had moved on. My job was filled the week after I left, and I had to figure out a new job in Thomas Group in the US. But more importantly, they had started moving into a lot of other businesses. They started taking on business way outside of technology. In fact, I believe they neglected technology. Let me give you an example. Hillenbrand Industries was a client. And, I taught seminars for Gus Hillenbrand and his staff. But, Hillenbrand built hospital beds and a lot of other things for hospitals. They owned Batesville caskets. That's pretty far from technology. So I thought, is this an opportunity to start a company? And I think I thought it was, because they were neglecting these core technology companies. I found that, I bet I could do this myself? So the answer, I think, was yes, because I went and queried some of my old contacts that were no longer clients of Thomas Group, and they said yes. So I went into saying, okay, I've got to figure out how to found a business, and what's the business model was a key issue. How do you finance? How do you get clients? And how do you do staffing? So one of the things that was key to me, financing, was, how do you get started? How do you manage the float? And how do you get going and make payroll and travel expenses and all those other costs? Clients was easier. I had good contacts with a lot of clients. Staffing turned out to not be terribly big problem in small quantities. And I'll tell you why in a moment. But let me talk about, so here I was, and what I wanted to do was have a lead client. So going back to what was key to me, I wanted to have a lead client to get started, and I accomplished this before incorporating. I wanted to have a business model that was as risk-free as possible, because I was going to bankroll this thing. So contracts were very well written. I learned to write contracts. We had lawyers to help us for years back in Thomas Group. And all of my contracts were fee plus expenses. So travel expenses was covered as a separate item, hotel expenses, food, everything was covered. And then there would be no payroll expenses if I didn't have a contract or a program. And then third, I knew a lot of good, high quality senior engineers and managers that were very capable, were done well with stocks, and were, I even hired 2 guys that I used to work for. And I hired other people, more senior than I, that really they thought, this is really a great deal. Because I said, it's fine to work 2 weeks a month. I'll pay you, about 30% more than you would ordinarily make. So the pay was good, and they could travel. They could work 2 weeks, and then they could be off 2 weeks and enjoy life. But they were very good. They were very dedicated, and I knew quite a few of these. And by quite a few, I mean 40 or 50. So that's how I got started and got these clients. And ASML, Siemens, ST Micro, Robert Bosch. And I did a consulting team-based approach. Each client got around 6 people on a team, had a team leader, and they went and we usually had a training session before we started. But then the team was really skilled. These are 30 to 40 year experienced people in the industry. And so they were quite good. I had fixed price contracts. I had some incentive-based contracts. And incentive meant that there was a low base payment. And then if we met certain goals every month, they would pay more. And that's how that worked. Now, one thing I did, let me go back and say, how did I get started? When I went to sell things, think about this. I would usually I'd end up giving a 30-minute presentation. If that was accepted, I had a 2-hour in-depth presentation of how we worked, what we worked on, what was important, why it was important, what we expected from them. And then I went and studied the plant. If that was acceptable, then I would say, okay, I want to come for 2 days and talk to all your managers, look at all your data, see how your factory runs, see how you do R&D, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, then if that was okay, I had one other thing that it turned out was very unusual, but really worked. And that was all companies had to attend a 1-week seminar, which was a training session, and it had to be off site. And I generally liked them about 30 or 40 miles off site, because I didn't want anybody, and I wanted the head, the president or the department head, his staff and the next staff to come to this. And I didn't want them to go back to work. I wanted their full attention for 5 days. And this was the way to do it. And they paid for these, by the way. Although I didn't charge for the seminar, they paid for the resort training facility and all the food.
Hey, Don, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to give you a quick reminder. We have about 5 minutes left before we have to jump into Q&A. I know you've got quite a few slides left, so I guess pick and choose what you'd like to touch on. We may need to extend this eventually to a part 2 because I know you've got some great information in here. So just
Okay.
and we're looking forward to hearing next.
I will forge ahead here. So that's how I got these clients, and that's how, you know, it was a low risk item. Growth versus staffing was a problem because when I ran out of my 50, 60 people I knew, trying to hire other people that had less experience or wanted to work full time was a big problem. And then the time demand as president who signed off the contract was a big problem, it turned out. So I'll have to skip this question on startups, but because of growth, there was this, I didn't know what to do. Grow, get big risks for hiring people that, you know, that didn't want to follow my precepts or skinny down or just stay the same. So I ended up selling that company. So I had one other thing. I went back to TGI for a little bit, and I found out that, you know, yeah, they had tremendous work in all these other areas, but the company's core values seem to have changed. So I thought I'll start another company. And the first one was a big project with Dresden, starting up an enormous new wafer fab, first time in East Germany. It was, you know, the first $1 billion wafer fab. And so that occurred. But what happened was, after that, I went back to my old clients, and they had taken everything I taught. They had the rights to all of my material, training sessions. They pulled that into corporate training and development, and they weren't too interested in it. So to make a quick story here, I found that there was another solution. The internet was booming, lasers were taking off, and there were a bunch of R&D facilities that wanted to be production facilities. And I got a client, Uniphase, that bought IBM's facility in Rushlikan, and they hired me to be the advisor to the president and vice president of manufacturing. A year-long deal. There was 2 weeks out of 4, and in the end, that was a giant problem. I should have never done that, because what happened was you could work 2 weeks, but in the 2 weeks you weren't there, they would regress. So the progress was about a third of what it should have been. And when it came time to renew, I never renewed. The good news is it led to going to Eindhoven, where Uniphase had bought Philips' facility in Eindhoven. And I came in as director of operations, full-time. I had one big financial mistake I made, but this was a fantastic experience. This company grew from 10 million in sales to 180 million in about a year and a half. It was very hard to recruit people. We recruited from Poland to Scotland. We brought in more than 100 people from Scotland, had to provide their staffing. But as a result of all this, I was promoted to the president and CEO because my boss basically took his bag of money and left. Now, he and I were the only Americans here. So came the next giant problem. There was a collapse of demand. There was lots of dark fiber. They had 4 plants that could manufacture lasers. They kept one, and it was the one near headquarters. So that meant I had to go through another complete closure, working with the Netherlands government, the unions, and the people there. But, you know, it was amazingly successful. It turned down, there was no problems, and it went well. And then I had one last thing I did. Intense Photonics was a little place in Scotland, right out of Glasgow in High Blantyre, and they wanted to build for the telecom industry some lasers, but of course it was in disarray. So we had to work on some other things. They had low-level manufacturing skills. This was a little tiny company. Telecom market was in trouble, so we developed some lasers for print industry, and Heidelberg Group Maschinen AG was the major client. But let me tell you, there was serious problems with financing this company. There was 4 venture capital firms, and they only put up money 1 year at a time. And so the whole management team spent half their time trying to figure out how to satisfy the venture capitalists as opposed to working on the problem. So after a couple of years there, I went back to the States, and I went to Finisar as a consultant, which was a VXL place in Richardson, Texas. And as speedy as I could be, that brings us to opportunities at the end. So this is my summary take, and ask questions in a moment. I do have a question slide. There's lots of opportunities today, as many as I had, maybe more. How do you find the best? Well, the first thing you got to do is look at your experience, look at your company, look at where you're going, look at where the company is going, and do all these mesh? And do your core competencies fit into these, or do you need to work on that? You can do some research, you can read technical journals, you can read the news journals, but that'll help. And maintain your contacts in other companies. And finally, I say, always find an area that you enjoy and contribute to. I don't necessarily say you have to love it, but you have to like it. It has to be something that entices you and you want to go contribute. So find those kind of areas, and always remember the 2 rules. Be certain to develop your core competencies and manage your boss' relationship. So in summary, though, just as I look around, I told this summer, I said, there's tremendous jobs out there in sensing, data gathering, data utilization, management of data. It's growing almost everywhere. So that's got to be a big growth area. And then I still find all this electrical engineering and computer science melded into biomedical is a great growth area, but there are many, many, many others. So my final comment, other elements, how did these things work out so well for me? Because frankly, they did work out well. And I think it's why I went in with knowledge and confidence. I was confident I could seriously improve every one of these companies. I still had enthusiasm, and I still do. I have enthusiasm for all the teams in the mentor program in Engineering 498. I had core competencies that didn't let me down, and I expanded from them. I went a long ways from manufacturing of ICs and memory chips and whatnot, but all of that stood me in good stead. I used training and tools a lot. I trained everybody. When I come into a new company, I had 1-hour training sessions to 3-day training sessions, and I did it for my COO department to the whole company, the upper management. And I had to add one more thing to your list of core competencies and manage your boss. Know what you know and know what you don't know. That is, know your limitations and know when to go hire somebody or go get the skills training or add some skills into your department so you're always successful. Questions?
Hi, Don. I think I will jump in. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much for that. I think everyone enjoyed it very much. I know I learned quite a bit, and I'm very interested to learn more about your career. So I'm thinking we need part 2 of this.
Well, you're right. There's a whole bunch of management
there's so
issues,
much
development issues, and training things.
Yeah, there's so much that clearly goes into it. So I'm definitely looking forward to a next one. Maybe we can recruit you. So with that, we have quite a few questions over here. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Feel free to just go ahead and answer them at your leisure. So the first one is, what is your take on moving up higher within the same company versus moving up even higher if the opportunity presents itself in another company, especially if it is in the exact technological space?
Well, I think that's something you have to think about. You know, there's something to be said for the continuity of being in the same company. You know the people, you know its problems, and you know how to manage them. You know the people. On the other hand, if the other company is identically the same, then you have to start thinking about what's the future look at if I compared the existing company to the new one, because both are probably good choices, but maybe one is just making much better steps or strides moving forward, and you can go with that further.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. The next question is, one of our listeners is interested in the semiconductor industry. His question is, how is the manufacturing semiconductor industry today in the US? Is it on the decline, increase, stagnant with respect to the last 8 years?
Well, the semiconductor industry in the U.S. is, I think, clearly declining. You know, A&D jettisoned all of their factories and became a design house. A lot of companies have done that. Intel is kind of struggling, and compared to TSMC, so a lot of this skill base is slowly eroding, and I really feel bad about that. But I think the answer is it's eroding right at this moment.
Awesome. Thank you. So we actually have a follow-up question to the first question. So that question is, how do you handle do not competes?
Non-compete clauses?
Yes.
Well, here I had to go make a deal with Thomas Group to be sure that, you know, that I was not competing with them. And Phil and I, the owner, Phil Thomas, and I agreed, and we had a little signed contract that I would not enter these kinds of businesses, and I could work on others. So I did have to take care of that. Beyond that, it wasn't too big a problem. And so legally, I never had a legal dispute with anybody. That's as clear as I can be.
Fair enough. Okay, couple questions. What's the most common mistake yourself or others have made during career development, and how would you advise others to avoid making these mistakes?
Well, I think I've gone over some of them because some of these were not good choices. You know, some of these boil down to, you know, why did I, let me give an example. Why did I ever leave that AMD job to go into consulting? And I gave a couple of reasons, but you know, probably there was another reason. And that is I've been 15 or 20 years running operations for companies, mostly were wafer fabs. And sometimes you just think, you know, I need a new outlook. And so sometimes that happens. And you got to be careful there. So the mistake was to let that overweight other considerations, really. But I think you just have to consider the future, where you want to go, and what your capabilities are. Are you looking to move up higher and higher in the company's hierarchy? Are you looking to broaden your base and make decisions based upon two things: what you really want to do and are capable of doing, and then what company best fits you in terms of those two issues?
That's a very well-rounded answer. Thank you. Another question we have, this is kind of a two-part, so just bear with me for a minute. You've obviously had a variety of opportunities or forks in the road present themselves. Were these opportunities something that you were actively seeking, or were you approached by recruiters? And a follow-up to that answer as well is, what advice do you have for people who are actively seeking jobs? How can they flip the dynamics so they're being recruited versus actively seeking jobs?
Well, those are good questions. And I had some of both. But, you know, I rarely went out and looked for a job. I had a lot of jobs come to me. And some were word of mouth. You know, the people I knew, that's why I say keep your contacts up. Is one of the directives. I had people in AMD said, you know, you really ought to consider this. Call Frank. He's got this opening. And that was that business unit manager. And the person that called me and Frank were people like colleagues of mine in past lives. So you got to keep that path open. And then headhunters, as we call them, recruiters, they are a nice path if you want to look broadly or you want to look quickly. I think they've got a lot more insight and a lot more ability to gin up possibilities. So that's how I look at it. Recruiters are a bit of a unusual set of folks in my mind, but they do serve a very good purpose.
I would agree, personal experience, recruiters, special kind.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that was all the questions I had in the chat. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, I think I'll pass it back to Christian to close out our meeting.
Okay. I have another question, maybe one last question. I'm really a fan of the presentation and how your experiences. I really love the fact that manager over salary is stated there. I wish I have this 20 years ago when I was starting, right? When I was starting my career. Can you give some qualities of a good manager, Don?
Yeah. I think this gets down to the core of some of those other things. I think a good manager has to be driven, has to have the goals in mind, and has to be really committed to reaching those goals. But they have to be able to pull all of their staff and everybody in their staff with them and make sure that they've got the tools to do their job, their part of the job, and be the catalyst for getting things going and driving not in a tyrannical sense, but in a pull sense of keeping everybody well focused, well supported, and well reviewed, so that before you go off the rails, things are starting to go wrong by your review process, and either could address that with the people or group or some other way. But I think you've got to do all of those things.
I agree. Well said, Don. Well said. Well, Don, it's time right now. Like what I said to Summer, we were just messaging each other, but we love you to be back in the IEEE EMBS. To present probably a more detailed one, especially this kind of presentation is close to my heart, since especially people that starting or people are within their mid on the career level. Really, this one is really important and essential to them. Thank you very much.
I was just going to say, well, thank you very much.
With that, Don, thank you very much. For the folks that attended this meeting, I really appreciate you guys attending. There will be more to come. Our plan is once a month, starting January of next year, and we'll send you some emails and flyers again. For the folks that's here, especially Dawn, Summer, thank you very much, and have a wonderful Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Yeah, thanks to all of you as well. I greatly appreciate the opportunity, and I hope there's a lot more.
We will. Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you, Don. Hope everybody has a great night.
All right,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I appreciate everybody attending. Bye now.
Appreciate you too, Don. Thank you.